In 845 CE, a Frankish princess stands barefoot in the snow as her palace collapses behind her in flames. Viking raiders tear her away by the hair. Her crown, proof of her bloodline, her legitimacy, her entire identity, has already been crushed into the mud. She screams. She pleads. She offers anything for mercy. But here is the truth history rarely admits. Death would have been the kind outcome. What the Vikings did to captured enemy princesses was so disturbing that medieval monks deliberately removed it from official chronicles. These were practices so extreme that even the medieval church, an institution that tolerated crusades, torture, and public executions, attempted to outlaw them. Entire sections of history were rewritten to avoid recording what happened next. In this episode, I'm going to reveal 3 things most textbooks still avoid. First, the blood eagle execution, often cited as the most infamous Viking punishment, was not even among the 5 worst outcomes for royal female captives. What the Norse called the Thrall Crown was far more devastating, and it destroyed victims psychologically before it ever harmed them physically. Second, there was a marriage practice so terrifying that multiple noble women chose suicide rather than endure it. We know this not from legend, but from burial evidence and contemporary accounts. Third, one princess survived years of captivity and orchestrated revenge on a scale so methodical and so lethal that over 5,000 people died, and the church later canonized her. If you want to understand the darkest chapter of Viking history, the one quietly skipped in classrooms, subscribe now. Because the third practice I reveal later in this video was intentionally suppressed for more than 2 centuries, and the reason behind that suppression will change how you see medieval Europe. Let's begin with what actually happened the moment Vikings captured a princess. Between 793 and 1066 CE, Viking raids were not random acts of violence. They were organized military campaigns aimed directly at royal courts. These attacks were calculated, planned, and executed with one goal in mind: capturing noble blood. The scale is larger than most people realize. Historians have confirmed at least 56 documented cases of queens, princesses, and high-born women taken captive during this period, and those are only the cases that survived censorship. These women were not treated as ordinary prisoners. To the Vikings, a captured princess was a strategic asset. She could be exchanged for massive ransoms, forced into alliances, or used to publicly destroy an enemy dynasty's honor. Humiliation mattered as much as conquest, sometimes more. European chroniclers across Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish sources repeatedly use the same phrase when describing these outcomes: fates worse than death. The wording appears again and again across regions that had no reason to coordinate their language. Yet 3 specific practices almost vanished from the historical record entirely. Not because they were myths, but because they were real. These details only resurfaced in the late 20th century, when archaeologists uncovered physical evidence that could no longer be explained away, evidence that contradicted centuries of sanitized history. Why were these truths buried? Because acknowledging them exposes something deeply uncomfortable. Several powerful European noble families today can trace their lineage back to these captive women. Their bloodline survived, but at an unspeakable cost. That story comes later. First, you need to understand what happened in the first hours after capture. When a Viking longship pulled away from shore with a princess bound in chains, the destruction of her identity began immediately, not with violence, but with ritual. It started with something known as the Thrall Crown. Imagine this. Less than a day ago, you lived in a palace. Servants dressed you. Courtiers bowed. Your name carried centuries of inherited authority. Now you are on a wooden deck surrounded by men who are about to erase every trace of who you were. This process, called royal thraldom, is recorded in the Frankish annals of St. Bertin in 882 CE. The first step was absolute stripping. Every royal garment removed, every jewel taken, every visible symbol of status erased. And that was only the beginning. You are forced to stand naked on the ship's deck while the entire crew watches in silence. Then someone steps forward, holding a blade. Your hair is shaved down to the scalp. In the medieval world, a woman's hair was not cosmetic. It symbolized femininity, fertility, lineage, and marriage value. Removing it was not about hygiene. It was about erasure. Viking raiders understood this perfectly. This was the moment a princess stopped being human in their system and became property. But the most devastating part was not physical. They took your name. Instead, they assigned you a number. Princess Gisela of the Franks, daughter of Charles the Bald, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, was captured in 882 CE. The Frankish annals describe her captivity with chilling precision. For 3 years, she was no longer Gisela. She was identified only as Thrall 47. Think about that. Your entire identity, your bloodline, your upbringing, your future, reduced to a number carved into an iron collar locked around your neck. And then came the market. Viking slave markets operated in major trade centers, such as Hedeby and Birka, but auctions involving royal captives were not routine transactions. They were spectacles, public events designed to humiliate as much as to profit. Contemporary sources describe princesses paraded through the market in chains, iron collars visible, numbers displayed. Buyers inspected them the way livestock was inspected, checking teeth, testing muscle strength, searching for marks that might reduce value. The annals of St. Bertin record that Giselle was sold 3 times in her first year of captivity. 3 different owners, 3 separate auctions. Each time, she stood on a raised platform while men bid openly for her. At this point, some people assumed survival meant mercy. It did not, because before these auctions, something else happened, something so disturbing that the monks who recorded it avoided describing it directly. They used euphemisms and coded language. They called it the breaking of the crown spirit. Archaeological discoveries have since confirmed what those phrases concealed. In 2003, a mass grave site in Ireland revealed skeletal remains of several high-status women. Their injuries followed specific patterns: repeated fractures that had healed and been broken again, tooth damage consistent with forced feeding during hunger strikes, shoulder dislocations that had been intentionally reset multiple times. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated torture designed to destroy resistance without leaving permanent visible damage, because damage captives sold for less. One woman attempted to starve herself to death. Her jaw was broken to force feed her. When it healed, she tried again. They broke it again. A living princess was worth gold. A dead one was not. But the iron collar was only the beginning, because some princesses were never sold. They were kept, and what happened to those women was so severe that in 865 CE, the Pope issued a specific condemnation attempting to ban one particular practice. Do not look away yet, because what comes next explains why some royal women chose death over capture. In 847 CE, Princess Thyra of Denmark was taken by a rival Viking faction. She was 17 years old. Over the next 12 years, she was married 7 times. Not sequentially, simultaneously. This practice was known as the peace bride system, and it was one of the most ruthless political mechanisms in medieval Europe. Here's how it worked. When a powerful jarl captured a princess, selling or ransoming her brought wealth, but not stability. Wealth could be lost. Alliances were harder to secure. So instead, the princess became a living treaty. She was married to one allied jarl, after another across different territories. Each marriage legitimized a ruler's claim through her royal bloodline. Each alliance strengthened the network around her captor. And here is the part rarely stated plainly. Those marriages were not exclusive. She was passed from one allied jarl to the next, and then to the next, and then again. Each marriage lasted anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Every ceremony was public. Every union was legally recognized under Norse law. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the 12th century, documented Princess Thyra's case precisely because it was so extreme it became infamous. In Gesta Danorum, he wrote, Princess Thyra was given as bride to 7 lords, each taking her in turn while the others yet lived. She bore children, 3 of them, yet poets called her untouched, for her spirit never yielded. Pause on that. She was forcibly married to multiple men at the same time. She bore children who were taken from her and raised as heirs within different territories. She was not treated as a wife, but as a biological instrument, used to legitimize several political dynasties at once. And each marriage ceremony was designed to break her psychologically. Imagine standing in a great hall filled with hundreds of witnesses. Your former husband is present, watching as you are formally married to another man. You are dressed in bridal garments. Priests conduct the rites. Everything is legal. Everything is sanctioned. Everything is considered normal. This was not an isolated incident. In 2011, archaeologists studying elite burial sites in Norway and Iceland identified a pattern that had puzzled researchers for decades. Graves of high-status women contained artifacts marking them as wives of powerful jarls. Yet genetic testing revealed something unsettling. Many of these women carried royal European bloodlines, Frankish, Saxon, and Irish. Even more disturbing, DNA analysis showed they had children with multiple men buried in entirely different regions of Scandinavia, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. This was not coincidence. It was evidence of a system. Captured princesses were distributed across alliances, married repeatedly, bore children for rival factions, and died far from their homelands. Their identities absorbed into Norse power structures. And then it gets worse. In 865 CE, Pope Nicholas I issued a letter condemning this practice. He called it abominabilis connugium, an abominable marriage, and threatened excommunication for any Christian ruler who tolerated it. But buried inside that letter was something historians overlooked for centuries. When scholars re-examined the original Latin text in 1998, they realized the Pope was not only condemning the marriages themselves, he was condemning a specific ritual that accompanied them. It was called the bride's gauntlet. Before each marriage ceremony, the captured princess was forced to walk between 2 lines of armed warriors. As she passed, they struck her with the flat of their swords. Not hard enough to maim, not enough to leave permanent scars, just enough to bruise, humiliate, and remind her publicly that she was owned. Later Christian scribes found this detail so disturbing that they removed it from most manuscript copies. We know it happened only because 3 uncensored versions of the papal letter survived. At this point, the question becomes unavoidable. Did any princess ever escape? Did anyone resist? Yes, one did. And what she did in return was so methodical, so devastating, that when you hear the full story, you'll understand why the church later declared her a saint. But before that, there's a third practice, one historians try to erase entirely from the archaeological record. Do not stop now, because the physical proof that this practice existed was only discovered in 2018. In 866 CE, Viking forces conquered Northumbria, in what is now northern England. King Osber died in battle. His sister, her name deliberately removed from the records, was captured alive. History remembers her only as the Princess of York. And what happened to her reveals the darkest secret of Viking royal captivity. 3 days later, they forced her to watch them kill her brother's children. 2 boys, her nephews, ages 7 and 9. But witnessing it wasn't enough. They made her take part. This event is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it remains one of the most disturbing entries in medieval history. The monks who documented it were so horrified that they resorted to euphemisms, phrases that concealed more than they revealed. Only in the last few decades have historians been able to reconstruct what truly happened by cross-referencing Norse sagas, legal texts, and archaeological evidence. The ritual was known as the blood witness. When Vikings captured a royal woman along with male members of her family, they sometimes performed a ceremony designed to guarantee her absolute submission. The princess was forced to assist physically in the execution of her own kin. She might be ordered to hold the chains, to hand over the weapon, or to stand with her hand placed on the executioner's shoulder as the sentence was carried out. This was not symbolic. It was deliberate. And in 2018, archaeology confirmed it. At a mass execution site in York, researchers uncovered sets of iron restraints buried together in deliberate arrangements. Large shackles sized for adult men. Smaller cuffs designed for much narrower wrists, likely female. But the decisive evidence came from chemical analysis. The corrosion patterns showed that the smaller cuffs had been held in direct contact with the larger restraints during the executions. In other words, the person wearing the smaller shackles was positioned close enough to touch the bound victim at the moment of death. Dr. Helena Mortensen, lead archaeologist on the excavation, wrote in her report, "The spatial configuration of these restraint systems indicates forced participation by a smaller statured individual, most plausibly female, during the execution process itself." Let that sink in. This is physical proof that women, almost certainly royal captives, were shackled in positions requiring direct contact with their own family members as they were killed. And here is what is rarely explained. This was not cruelty for spectacle alone. It was psychological warfare. In Norse culture, witnessing or assisting in the death of a close relative without seeking revenge carried devastating spiritual consequences. A person who did so was considered nigr, dishonored, socially dead, unworthy of protection or status. Norse legal code from the period are explicit. A woman who witnessed a kinsman's death and did not avenge it can never reclaim honor. She was permanently marked as fit only for thrallhood. The Vikings understood this. They were placing captured princesses into an impossible choice: participate or die. But either way, her honor was destroyed. Even if she escaped, she could never return home. Her own society would reject her. And the method of execution they used makes even the blood eagle seem merciful by comparison. It was called weighted drowning. The victim was bound in chains and slowly lowered into a pit that was gradually filled with water. Not thrown in, not drowned quickly, lowered inch by inch, over hours. And the captive princess was forced to assist, helping guide the chains, standing at the edge, watching the water rise. We know this because 3 separate excavation sites, York, Dublin, and a location in northern France, contain execution pits with the same architectural features: stepped interior walls, anchor points at multiple heights, and evidence of controlled descent rather than sudden immersion. The York site yielded skeletal remains showing death by drowning, combined with forensic indicators of prolonged restraint. Analysis confirmed that these victims survived for several hours after the process began. Hours of awareness, hours of fear, hours of waiting. And the princess had to stand there the entire time. Now here is a question you're probably asking. What happens to a woman after something like that? And more importantly, why would the church later protect one of these women and elevate her to sainthood? That answer comes next. So how often did this happen? How widespread was this practice, really? We have documented evidence of at least 12 separate incidents across 3 different regions where royal women were forced to participate in the execution of their own family members. 12 confirmed cases, verified through chronicles, legal texts, and archaeological findings. And those are only the ones that survived the record. How many others were never written down? How many accounts were softened, erased, or deliberately omitted because even medieval chroniclers could not bring themselves to describe them? But remember what I promised at the beginning. I told you that one princess survived, and when she finally gained power, her response was so precise, so devastating, that the church later elevated her to sainthood. Her name was Olga of Kiev, and what she did makes everything you've just heard seem restrained by comparison. In 945 CE, Princess Olga watched her husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, die in one of the most brutal executions recorded in early medieval Europe. Drevlian warriors captured him, bent 2 trees toward the ground, tied his legs to each trunk, and released him. His body was torn apart. Afterward, the Drevlian leadership sent messengers to Olga with a proposal: marry their prince. legitimize their control over Kiev, and in return, she would be spared. They expected submission. They expected another peace bride. They did not understand who they were dealing with. What happened next is documented in Byzantine chronicles, the Russian primary chronicle, and, crucially, confirmed by archaeology. For centuries, historians dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Then the excavations began. What Olga carried out was not rage. It was strategy. Phase 1. The buried ambassadors. When the Drevlian envoys arrived in Kiev, Olga greeted them with courtesy. She told them she was honored by their proposal. She ordered her people to carry the ambassadors through the city in their boat, a gesture meant to symbolize respect. The ambassadors believed they had succeeded. Instead, Olga had them carried directly to a deep pit that had been prepared in her courtyard. Still seated in their boat, they were lowered in. Then she ordered the earth thrown over them. The Russian primary chronicle records her words as she stood at the edge of the pit. "Is the honor to your taste?" This was deliberate psychological reversal. The same slow, inescapable death Vikings had imposed on captured royalty. In 2003, archaeologists excavating the ancient center Kiev uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of a wooden vessel and 17 adult male skeletons. Soil was found in the airways. Bone positions showed signs of panic and attempted movement. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial precisely in 945 CE. Phase 2, the bathhouse inferno. Olga then sent another message to the Drevlian prince. "Send your most distinguished men to escort me to your land in honor." The Drevlians complied, dispatching their elite nobles. The primary chronicle states there were 47. When they arrived, Olga offered them hospitality, a ritual bath before their journey. It was customary, respectful. They entered the bathhouse. The doors were sealed. The building was set ablaze. None survived. Between 2015 and 2017, excavations in Kiev uncovered the remains of a 10th century bathhouse destroyed by intense fire. Inside was skeletal remains of 43 adult males, all showing signs of death by burning. Chemical analysis of the structure revealed iron bracing added to the doors from the outside after the building's original construction, exactly as the chronicle described. Phase 3 was still to come, and this is where Olga's revenge shifted from punishment to annihilation. "I am coming to my husband's grave," Olga told the Drevlians, "to hold the funeral feast, prepare the ceremony." Somehow, they still did not understand. The Drevlians prepared an enormous memorial gathering at Iskarostan, their capital. Nearly 5,000 people attended, warriors, nobles, elders. In practical terms, it was the entire military and political leadership of the tribe. Olga's forces served the food. They poured the drink. They waited. When the crowd was fully intoxicated, Olga gave the signal. Her soldiers fell upon them. The Russian primary chronicle does not soften the account. It states plainly that Olga's army slaughtered 5,000 people during the feast. This was not a battle. It was an execution. And the archaeology confirms it. Excavations at Iskarostan have revealed a vast mass grave complex dating to the mid-940 CE, containing the remains of thousands of individuals killed in a single violent episode. Bone positioning shows victims were seated or prone when attacked. Skull trauma indicates execution-style blows, single strikes from above or behind, consistent with people who were unarmed, drunk, or incapacitated. Phase 3 was complete, but Olga was still not finished. She returned with her full army and placed Iskarostan under siege. After months of resistance, she sent a final message. "I have taken my revenge. I will lift the siege if you pay a small tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household." Desperate and exhausted, the city agreed. When the birds were delivered, Olga's soldiers tied small bundles of sulfur wrapped in cloth to their legs, set them alight, and released them. The birds flew home. They returned to their nests, into the thatched roofs of Iskarostan. That night, the city burned. The primary chronicle records. There was not a house that did not burn, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames, for all the houses caught fire at once. Archaeological excavations confirm a catastrophic burn layer across approximately 90% of the settlement, all dating to the same moment in the mid-10th century. Fire damage patterns show simultaneous ignition across the city, exactly what would occur if hundreds of burning birds landed throughout the settlement. Now comes the part that challenges modern assumptions. The Christian Church later declared Olga a saint. She is remembered as Saint Olga of Kiev, honored on July 11th, and revered by the Orthodox Church as equal to the apostles. After completing her revenge, she converted to Christianity and spent the remainder of her life promoting the faith across Kievan Rus. The Church's reasoning was simple. Everything she did happened before her baptism, but the real historical consequence of Olga's actions goes far beyond sainthood. After 945 CE, Viking and Viking line groups largely stopped targeting Slavic royal women for capture. The shift is visible in the records. Between 900 and 945, there are 23 documented cases of Slavic princesses being taken captive. Between 945 and 1000, there are only 3, and all were carried out by groups unaware of Olga's reputation. Word had spread. Capture a Slavic princess, and her family would destroy your world. Archaeology supports this shift. Viking graves in Eastern Europe after 945 show a sharp decline in Slavic royal artifacts. Jewelry, insignia, status objects once taken from captured nobility. At the same time, Frankish and Anglo-Saxon royal goods increase in Scandinavian burial contexts. The strategy changed. Olga's revenge was so public, so methodical, and so devastating that it worked. It did not end the system, but it made one group untouchable. And that is why her story survived. Because for once, a captured woman did not merely endure history. She reshaped it. The capture and abuse of royal women did not suddenly stop. What changed was where it happened. After one woman demonstrated that the price of the system could be the complete destruction of an entire people, the practice shifted geographically. So, let's pull everything together. Between 793 and 1066 CE, nearly 3 centuries, Viking raiders and their allied forces captured at least 200 royal women, princesses whose lives were deliberately stripped from popular memory. Some were sold into thraldom, their names erased, their identities reduced and numbers etched into iron collars. Some were turned into peace brides, transferred from one jarl to another like political instruments, forced to bear children that legitimized dynasties built on their captivity. Others were compelled to witness or assist in the execution of their own families, carrying the weight of that trauma and the spiritual consequences it imposed, until their deaths. And this story does not end in the medieval period. In 2019, a large-scale genetic study of Icelandic populations revealed something striking. Roughly 62% of maternal lineages trace back to the British Isles and Western Europe, while paternal lineages remain overwhelmingly Scandinavian. In other words, the biological legacy of these captured women is still present, encoded in the DNA of modern populations. The system ended only because of 2 forces. First, the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries, which began to delegitimize these practices. Second, the demonstrated consequences of retaliation, made unmistakably clear by figures like Olga of Kiev, whose response showed that the cost of such brutality could be existential. But here is the uncomfortable truth. For nearly 300 years, this was not considered exceptional. It was routine. Royal women were not seen as individuals. They were strategic assets, military objectives, and tools of psychological warfare. We remember Gisela because her father's court kept records. We remember Thyra because poets preserved her story. We remember Olga because her revenge was so devastating it became impossible to ignore. Most of the others are gone. They survive only as genetic data points, unnamed skeletons in mass graves, iron collars in museum cases with no identities attached. So before you comment, take a moment and consider this. Which part of this history affected you most? The ritual stripping of identity through thraldom, the calculated cruelty of the peace bride system, the forced participation in family executions, or Olga's revenge, and the fact that we venerate her despite the scale of violence she unleashed? And here is a harder question. Was Olga a hero who fought back, or a war criminal whose methods mirrored the brutality she opposed? Is there a moral distinction between what was done to these women and what she did in response? This is not a simple question, and thoughtful answers matter. Next week, we will examine another erased chapter. What happened to captured Viking warriors when the roles were reversed? And fair warning, what the Anglo-Saxons did to their prisoners makes the Blood Eagle look merciful by comparison. If you've stayed this far, you're someone willing to confront history without filters. Like the video, share it with someone who thinks they already understand the Vikings, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thanks for watching.